I've recently went back and started playing and replaying a lot of the old Assassin's Creed games, so I decided why not make a top 10 list since it's a pretty original idea. Leave your top 10 or top 5 favorite Assassin's Creed games down in the comments. I am actually interested to see them and why you think a game is better than I do. Maybe I'll go through and replay some of them. I thought this was a pretty perfect time to make this video since it's been brought to you by Ubisoft. By the way, they did not have any influence on my choices of games in this list. They just don't want you to miss out on any of the crazy deals going on right now where you can pick up these games for yourself in this giant Steam sale for just a few bucks. Assassin's Creed Mirage will release on October 12th, so if there's an Assassin's Creed game here that you haven't played or want to refresh on some of the games while waiting for Mirage, now is the perfect time to head on over and check out the Stealth Fest sale going on again right over on Steam, where they've got some really good deals that you don't want to miss out on, as you can grab them for up to 85% off. Just check out the links down in the description. If you don't know which games to buy, I'll be going a lot more in depth with these games later on in the video, so thank you to Ubisoft for sponsoring it. So here are the top 10 best Assassin's Creed games. First off, Assassin's Creed 1. Alright, don't go pulling out the hidden blade on me. It's not a terrible game, just not as good as the rest. At least playing it now. The setting is great. I wish they'd do another newer game in this medieval type setting, but it's also just like the perfect assassin feeling setting. I don't know if it's just that this is the original game and it's set here or what, but the game in general was the embodiment of an Assassin's Creed game. Not only that, but I mean Altair is like the top dog, man. Even though I prefer some of the other assassins over him, you can't really say that out loud. He is like the OG Loke of this universe. I think this trailer here still plays a role in why these games are so popular. When this thing first came on TV, I was like, holy crap, that's cool. There wasn't really a game like it, and the trailer hyped it up to the max. Obviously, there were some crazy good trailers for later games, but I think everyone who plays these games is chasing that feeling they had when this first popped up on TV, at least if you're old enough to remember that. I highly recommend playing it for the story of Altair, because you will enjoy the following games a lot more if you at least know the story. Plus, I mean, in memory, this game is up there with the best. But in comparison to some of the newer games, if not all of them gameplay-wise, it has not aged very well. It's just hard to hold my little 2023 aged brain's attention span long enough to get into any game, and this is one of the hardest to get into for me. Especially if you've already played it, already seen cutscenes, and already played through those modern day sections. The combat is as simple as it gets. Just hold block or counter and you'll destroy everyone. I mean, maybe that's just accidentally canon, man. I guess it speaks to how strong Altair is because you can just walk through every single enemy. To be fair though, a lot of the combat is some of the most realistic looking, yet at the same time just makes Altair look like an absolute badass with every counterattack. It just tends to get a little repetitive after 10 hours of just doing that. On top of that, it was actually crazy how easy it was to just hide and escape combat anytime you really needed to. If you wanted to get out of combat, you could just basically stand next to someone and you were good. It hasn't aged crazily well because of how much better these games in general have become since it released, but at the time this was a game changer for not only open world games but gaming in general. For the first time we had this massive historical fiction setting we could run around in, interactive crowds, and this cool combat system which at the time didn't feel as repetitive. Clearly other games have been influenced by it over the years, as well as obviously the parkour. This is not at all a bad game, one of my favorites in memory, but I would imagine it's a little harder to get into after playing more updated games. This was like the seed that started the series, and I recommend playing it if you haven't yet. Especially if you haven't watched much on the story or want something you can just lay back and grind through. So, next game, some of y'all are not going to like me for having this so low, Assassin's Creed Syndicate. I know this is a lot of people's favorite Assassin's Creed game lately, and you're staring at my video like, this freaking guy. I mean, it is a good game. I think it deserved more love when it released, but it's just not up there with the best for me. This is like Gangs of New York meets Assassin's Creed, except it's set in 1868 England, which is a pretty interesting setting. That part is really cool. They brought in a new mechanic where you can zip line, which I actually thought was awesome. I know a lot of people didn't, although most of the time in the open world I spent it just running over people in the stagecoach. But the zip line was a nice addition to change things up and give us some interesting ways to assassinate targets and get around easier if you're lazy like me and don't feel like climbing straight up with every single building you encounter. Again though, I had even more fun in the stagecoach. There's nothing more natural than taking out the ops with a drive-by throwing knife.
Easy.
I think it's worth playing, especially if you get it on sale. It just didn't really hook me. I personally didn't care much for the characters. Evie's character was okay, but didn't have much to her personality. Jacob Fry, her twin brother, I mean, it seemed like we played as him actually most of the time rather than half of the time. His writing is just like, sometimes he's okay, and other times I'm like, why is he like this? If you don't take him too seriously and see him as just like some type of action movie type of character where his decisions are questionable and he's just an asshole for the sake of being an asshole to everyone every chance he gets, you might like the story a bit better than me.
What's this?
God's sake! Are you trying to blow the gaff?
What?
For what it's worth, I think he did become a little more tolerable later on, and also the story I thought got a little bit better in the late game, where early on I just really wasn't into it. Felt very rushed and I just didn't really care. Overall, kind of fun for an open world game, especially just free roaming. Some of the missions that give you multiple ways to take out targets had some cool ideas in there, just not my favorite. Although I still haven't played the DLC, which I know has something to do with Jack the Ripper, and I hear it's really good, so I guess I'll have to give that a try next. So yeah, I love Altair, but strictly going off of which one I would rather play right now, if you gave me the option, I'd probably go with Syndicate. Assassin's Creed 3. At first, I had this game much higher on the list, because it's always been one of my favorite Assassin's Creed games, but the competition up top is just tough, man. On one hand, I think it's like the best Assassin's Creed game, and on the other hand, it's not the one I'm gonna go out of my way to replay. Back when this game first came out, I was pretty iffy about it. I thought the twist to the story was really cool, but it's also why it took so dang long to get into the actual meat of the game. You've got like a 6-hour prologue, which I didn't mind when I first played it, but playing it a second time, it's pretty tough. It's fun, but pretty rough, man. Connor's character, I was 50-50. He gives you the constant I'm angry all the time attitude, which is justifiable considering why he's that way. But after a while, it's just kind of like, eh. But that's exactly why he's so much fun to play as, because it shows in his combat. This was like the most brutal assassin at the time, and probably still is. I'm probably 50-50 on like every aspect of this game. The prologue portion, playing as Haytham, is a little too long and probably should have been a bit shorter, and then having to build yourself back up as Connor, almost playing in his own prologue as well, feels like forever. At least if you're giving it a second playthrough, it can be brutal. On the other hand, it kind of makes it more rewarding when you finally have your assassin robe and can run around hatcheting the small little militias around the city. Another good part about this long prologue and why the game doesn't suffer too much from it is because I really like Haytham Kenway's character and how you get a perspective into his life while playing as him before it completely flips around on you. It sort of plants the seeds of maybe Templars weren't all straight up evil people, where prior to this, it just felt like Templars were just all evil, for no other reason than to just be that way. It gave you a glimpse into this guy's life where with most antagonists, the game just tells you that they're bad and we should hate them, or just shows the villain kill someone so that now we know he's evil, but I have no idea who this guy even is. The other thing that draws me to this game and gets me to hop back on every now and then is the setting. This is probably my favorite setting in Assassin's Creed. This time in history, the American Revolution, is probably my favorite to learn about, so when it threw me right into the middle of it, it was pretty freaking sweet. You're there at the Boston Tea Party, Paul Revere, the Declaration of Independence. It's pretty freaking cool walking down the streets of 1700s Boston and New York, beating the crap out of the redcoats with your hatchet. Alright, before I say this next one, you've got to know, again, this was a hard list to make, alright? I thought it'd be easy, but I rearranged this list like 6 different times after replaying some of them and trying to decide what was worth more, how it felt playing it back then in memory or how it feels playing it today. So here we go, Assassin's Creed 2, which introduced my favorite character in the series, Ezio.
Look how they massacred my boy.
This is up there with the best, story-wise, but I mean gameplay-wise it just suffers similarly the same way the first game does, in that it's just age. First of all, this was a massive improvement at the time. When Assassin's Creed 2 released, it was already so much more improved and Ezio arguably even more loved than Altair, which is rare as hell for a sequel. There are a few games where you can just bring in a whole new main character and like them more than the original character, who was already really cool. I feel like Assassin's Creed 2 already started kind of straying just a tad away from the real Assassin's Creed feel that the first game had, and I mean I think that's because the first game was Altair, who is as Assassin's Creed as it gets. He's like the embodiment of an assassin. The second game brought in new things like upgrading the city, a really cool mechanic and one of the only things I haven't seen copied and beaten to death by other open world games, a way more fleshed out combat system that still holds up pretty decently. I mean I know I said this game is aged, but it's just aged in comparison to the games higher up on this list. It's still a pretty fun game to play. You also had a ton more weapons in Assassin's Creed 2 where you could even take enemies' weapons and use them against them, and everything just felt way more fleshed out. Plus I mean, again, it's what brought us Ezio.
It is a good life we lead, brother.
The best. May it never change.
And may it never change us.
Now the next game has possibly one of the most intriguing main characters in the series, Assassin's Creed Rogue. I've always thought Rogue was one of the most underrated Assassin's Creed games out there, partially because it was overshadowed by Assassin's Creed Unity, which launched the same day for next-gen consoles, while Rogue was like the last-gen breadcrumbs that it felt like we were given. Because at the time, once the Xbox One and PS4 released, when a game also brought a last-gen edition, it was usually pretty bad in comparison to the next-gen version. Like I remember Black Ops 3 launching not too long after, and the last-gen version was terrible in comparison to the Xbox One version. Not quite the same scenario, but it's how it felt when it released. Especially since this was like the same exact gameplay experience as Black Flag. I think it used like all of the exact same assets, or at least it felt like it. Plus, I mean, these new consoles launch and a new Assassin's Creed game is coming out. Rogue felt like the downgraded version of Unity. So I went into this thinking it couldn't be that great of a story since it was kind of just tossed at us last-gen peasants. But man, I was wrong. I think the route that they took with the story here is really freaking cool. I don't want to spoil anything in case you want to play it for yourself, and there are some twists in here. It actually ties right into Unity, almost like a little prequel to the game. Basically, you play as an assassin turned Templar who has defected against the assassins, and even though it feels like you've been playing as a villain at first, you're really not. He's just on the other side. He has his own reasonings for joining the Templars, which ends up being pretty understandable, and just the entire idea of, oh wait, we're not an assassin, we're a Templar, who has been trained as an assassin, was really, really cool. I really love this game, and if you haven't played it, I definitely recommend trying it out. It's got one of the more interesting stories I've seen in an Assassin's Creed game, and also, the game seemed like almost like it was going to be a filler when it first released, but it's actually connected to a bunch of different games. Like I said, it's connected to Unity, also Assassin's Creed 3, and Black Flag. I know this is like the 6th spot from the top, but this is a severely underrated game. Or at least it was when it came out. When I had first played it, nobody even knew it existed. So next up, Assassin's Creed Origins. Pretty mid-level of this list, right? Like it seems like most people either think this is the best game ever made, or that it's just a terrible Assassin's Creed game. Well, I placed it at number 5 because I cannot finish it. I've begun playing this game about 4 different times, and even though I have a lot of fun playing it for like 6 hours straight without moving from my seat, for whatever reason, I can't beat it, man. Every single time I start a new game, kill my son, and then once I'm free to really explore, that's all I do for hours, just hunting animals and upgrading my stuff. Then I get off, and boom, I never touch it again. I don't even know why. But when I sit and think of an Assassin's Creed game that I would enjoy just hopping on and playing right now, this is the first game that comes to mind. I think I've spent upwards of like 8 or 9 hours playing each time, and I don't even make it past the 2nd or 3rd main mission, or memory. And those main story missions are usually the first thing I do in these games. I just get too distracted, and the open world in here, especially some of the more populated areas, are legitimately fun. Just off the top of my head, I think this is the first and only, if not one of the very few Assassin's Creed games where you hunt animals. I know Odyssey had something similar, but not quite as emphasized. And definitely not as cool as this more realistic but ancient world where you're in crocodile-infested waters trying to float by them on a boat made out of popsicle sticks. What's crazy is it took me forever to play Origins because it just didn't look interesting to me. The only reason I even tried it was because I went Black Friday shopping one year to try and get an Xbox One and ended up coming home with Origins as well. I wasn't going to put this on the list because of the fact that I haven't even come close to beating it, but when I think of an Assassin's Creed game that is super fun to play with a world I want to spend more time in, this is up there with the best. I just need to actually finish it. 4th on the list, but definitely not least, Assassin's Creed Brotherhood. The gameplay in here probably doesn't hold up super well in comparison to some of the newer Assassin's Creed games, but man, at the time, this shit was
perfect. Perfect. Everything, down to the last minute details.
First off, I had completely forgotten about the multiplayer in here. They had that one mode called Wanted, kind of like Assassin's Creed Among Us, where you pick a specific character and your goal is to not get assassinated by the other players. There's only one person, from what I remember, actually hiding from the assassins, and their goal is to find you among the different crowds of people who some of look the exact same as you. I believe there were other game modes, but that's like the only one I remember off the top of my head, and it was really cool. So the main game itself, I mean, if you're old enough to have some form of consciousness when this trailer dropped, it was one of the coolest things you'd ever seen. At first, it looks like a regular Assassin's Creed trailer, and then you're like, what? Like, come on, man.
Desmond, that was pretty awesome.
It just felt natural.
Number 3 is a game that definitely surprised me being so high up on this list, and that is Assassin's Creed Unity. I actually never played this game until I decided to make this video, and man, was I surprised. Everyone says this is the best Assassin's Creed game or the most underrated, and it's like the definition of a cult classic at this point. Obviously, a lot of the love for this game comes vastly from the parkour. I've seen everyone's comments about it so many times, and I've always thought, yeah, but it can't be that good. But it actually is. It's not that it does anything necessarily revolutionary, it's the fact that it just feels like some of the most fluid and smoothest parkour I've played in an Assassin's Creed game, where I'm not getting stuck on every single doorway or corner of a wall. There's not these weird pauses in between climbing or mantling between objects, or at least not nearly as much. While you're traversing around France, you've got this full lived-in feeling city with giant crowds around that are actually doing something like rioting or listening to a speech or having a party. It just feels like you're in an actual city. The biggest things that annoyed me were some petty little things, like I try to go for 100% completion, which usually means different stealth challenges, and man, do you have to get creative or replay an entire memory 100 different times until you're perfect at it. 99% of the reason being that they got rid of the whistle. And weirdly enough, I rarely even use the whistle in these games, but this was like the one main game I was constantly trying to whistle. If you want to lure an enemy over, which you have to do a lot, you've got to either be spotted by them enough to get them to be curious, but not enough to actually be alerted and start chasing you, or use the firecrackers, which put you out in the open and half the time they don't even hear them go off. This is especially annoying at the beginning of the game when you have no equipment unlocked other than firecrackers, and you have no idea what you're doing yet. Another reason you can count on stealth so much in this game is because the combat can be pretty brutal, especially if you're trying to just run around into a highly populated area with enemies, where in a lot of the other games, that was pretty easy to do. And if I was just trying to get through a sequence, I would just run in and parry counter everyone, no problem. It is much harder to do in Unity though. You have to time your parries, unlike most Assassin's Creed games where you press the button so it's going to parry. It was a little more difficult in here, but it does eventually become pretty easy learning their moveset, so you know right when they're going to try and swing and exactly when you need to counter. Not an insanely complicated combat system, but some of the most fun I've had with combat in Assassin's Creed, especially recently, where I had played Syndicate not too long before this, and the combat felt like a giant breath of fresh air. Until, you spend 20 minutes doing everything perfectly and get caught and killed right at the very end, and have to basically do that memory over again. That's always fun. Finally did all that and I died. Dude, what the fuck? The story in Unity is actually pretty good, and I think that was the most surprising part for me, because all I ever hear about is the parkour. I feel like the beginning of the story hooked me a lot more than the rest of it, but still pretty dang good. I haven't started the DLC yet, which I hear is pretty good too, but Arno is a character I could imagine spending a lot more time with in the future. I really hope we'll get a sequel at some point. For me, Unity is like peak Assassin's Creed in terms of feeling like a modern version of the original game. It's probably the closest thing to what 2007 me was imagining the future of Assassin's Creed games to play like. Assassin's Creed Revelations. Ezio is by far my favorite Assassin's Creed character, even one of my favorite video game characters ever. And this is where Ezio's character is completed and really where the absolute love I had for the story in these games kind of peaked. This is where the story was still extremely grounded. This game's ending and conclusion to Ezio's story was perfect. This is like peak Assassin's Creed story and writing in my opinion.
I have lived my life as best I could, not knowing its purpose, but drawn forward like a moth to a distant moon. And here at last, I discover a strange truth. That I am only a conduit for a message that eludes my understanding.
To me, this game is like Logan for Wolverine. You see this invincible dude you've been following around for years become old and everything finally concluding, even though you're not really ready for it to end. A gigantic reason people love Ezio so much is because he is the most complete character in the series. He got 3 games that stretched across his entire life. You see him in Assassin's Creed 2 as a teenager when he becomes an assassin until pretty late into his life, where he's an adult around the same time as Brotherhood starts out, and then towards the end of his life in Revelations. If Ubisoft ever decided to release another game about a previous character, like I know a lot of people want Bayek from Origins to have another game, that thing would go crazy. Even Syndicate, with again, probably my least favorite characters, would probably end up getting me to like them just from seeing more development in their character and spending more time with them. I imagine if Assassin's Creed 2 was the end of Ezio's story and they didn't give him any sequels, he might be up there with my favorite characters still. Probably not though, because I mean, he would be a lot more forgettable. Now, I've got to say, I have not played this game since it released. At least not super in depth, just a little bit here and there. Alright, we've finally made it to the #1 spot, and here it is. Assassin's Creed 4 Black Flag. Now maybe I'm looking at this game through a sea shanty tinted glass because I haven't played it in years, but this game was crazy ahead of its time, man. The first time I played this game, I was not expecting to like it at all. But I rented this along with the Stick of Truth from Redbox. I chugged through the Stick of Truth, one of the most underrated games out there, by the way, and was like, man, it can't get any better than this. And this thing went crazy. It didn't have the most memorable story that I've played for an Assassin's Creed game. I could be wrong. I just don't remember the details of it too much. Like, I remember some sad parts where I was like, oh no, that sucks. But it was by far the most fun, and most time I've spent just exploring and leveling up and upgrading stuff. For example, my ship, which at first I was like, what the heck is this ship? This is an Assassin's Creed game. I am assassin. But man, after a couple of hours, you didn't even realize you're just trying to do everything in your power to get that next ship upgrade. Like, oh, I need this whale part, so now I need to go over to a whale location, hop on the little dinghy boat, and actually harpoon a whale. I don't care if I have to jump into the water and hand deliver a harpoon to a baby whale's blowhole. I am getting that little ram thing that goes at the end of my boat. I think I spent like 50 or 60 straight hours in Black Flag just grinding through upgrades, not doing anything else. I mean, obviously it didn't take that long just for the upgrades, but I've never had so much fun grinding for these upgrades and as much fun for that long in an open world game without really getting bored. The combat is absurd. You have the dual rapiers just going absolutely wild, shredding Templars and then sending them into the ocean with some homemade gills. Plus, I mean, like I said, I think what makes it or breaks an Assassin's Creed game for me is the setting. And this is by far the most immersive pirate game out there. It really makes you feel like you could contract 1400s hepatitis at any moment. Really though, this shit was so cool when it first released, and there's still not another game like it. It's not the best Assassin's Creed game if you strictly want linear parkour or a stealth game. It does have that. You've got the cities and different islands and all of that. But Black Flag was the perfect balance for me between that type of game and the massive open worlds they've created lately. It wasn't extremely small, but also not too big. It is peak Assassin's Creed, and you cannot change my mind. So just some runner-ups that I thought would be unfair to rank. Assassin's Creed Odyssey. I played this when it first released, loved some of it, hated some of it, but haven't played it since and never completed it. I think it was actually a pretty decent game with a really cool setting, some really cool mythology if you appreciate it for its own game. But man, for me, the pacing and time it takes to beat was a lot for me, to where I just never finished it. If you've got some time to kill, I'd recommend giving it a try. I might go ahead and give it another go myself since they've updated the heck out of it since I stopped playing. And then Assassin's Creed Valhalla. I have still never played it. It seems like people either love it or hate it, and I want to play it for myself before really giving an opinion on it. But back when it first released, I was gone for like a year and a half for training related to work and couldn't really play video games or do much outside of training, so I just never touched it. So yeah, that was my top 10 Assassin's Creed games. Don't forget to check out the sale on Steam and get these games for super cheap before the sale ends.